Okay, so last time we did this little project, which is a quote-unquote dictionary, illustrated dictionary of 4 words in Hiligaynon, Hiligaynon sea animals. We've got a dolphin and a shark and an octopus and a stingray. So we went through a process of writing this page, right? So you may remember what we did. Basically, we had a JSON structure called animals, which consisted of an array, and in that array were 4 objects. And each object has in turn 4 attributes or keys, and each key has a value, which in this case, all of them are strings. So we take, in order to render those things to the screen, we have this function called render animal, and that renders one of these objects, right? So we use a template string and just essentially stamp out some HTML right here. You'll remember that this notation means find the value of the field with that particular name and stick it in the HTML. And then once we've rendered that, we call that variable HTML. Once it's stamped out, then we just stick it into the page using this insert adjacent HTML function. I didn't talk about this last time, but basically what it does is it says go to the end of the HTML tag, which looks like, well, it's here, right? Except the document body. So you go to the end of the body tag, and before it ends, insert that HTML. So these animal sort of divs here are being inserted one by one at the end of the page. So okay, so anyway, what we're going to do this time is add sort of basic search to this thing. So the plan looks like this. We are going to start, we just did that. And then to do this, we need to build up, first we need to build up an understanding of this thing called a Boolean, which is a yes, no. And then we're going to learn about how to compare 2 strings and see if they're the same or not. And then we're going to extend that to seeing whether a string is the same as the value of an object. That sounds more complicated than it is. And once we have this under our belts, this notion of how to get a yes or a no to the question of whether 2 strings are the same, we're going to move on to this thing called a filter. And a filter is essentially, like, you can think of it as a tiny search engine where the database is an array, and then you pass it one of these guys to just select those members of the array that pass a test. So we'll see how that works, first with an array of strings just to get the idea across, and then with filtering an array of objects. So that array of objects is what our animals variable contains. So then at that point, we'll have written a little function that runs this search for us. And the last step will be to set up a user interface. So we'll talk about that. Okay, so let's start with this notion of a Boolean. And to do that, we don't even need to talk about the animals database to start with. We'll just use the console. So I'm going to crank up the font size here, thanks to a recommendation from Danny. So the easiest thing to ask yourself is this true or false? What are we going to get back? Obviously, it's going to say true. If we say this, it will say false. Note that this is a double equal sign. If you're not familiar with this in programming, pretty basic thing, but it means equality. This sign, a single equal sign, means assignment. And so if I do this, it's actually going to be an error because I'm trying to assign to a string, which you can't do. A string, of course, being something that's contained in double quotes. In JavaScript, you can also contain things in single quotes. And as we saw yesterday, you can, the double quotes are the default, I guess. You can also use this backtick business, so that works just as well. And backticks, of course, have that a possibility of interpolating things, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, okay, so Booleans. So this thing here is essentially a Boolean. Is it true or not? That's a kind of a predicate function, you might call it, and that's going to be false. So you can write a function that runs such a comparison. So we're going to say we're going to write a function whose name will be isDog, and it will take some string. Let's call that string. Well, let's just call it some string, and then we'll say some string equals dog. So this is our first arrow function. So now we've defined something called isDog. If we say what is isDog, it says, well, it's a function. And the way that we've defined it here means you're going to pass in some string, and it's going to run this thing, and it's going to return true or false. So let me just demonstrate here. If I say this, what do you think it's going to give me? False. If I give it this, of course, it will give us true. So that's like this is a function. It's a named procedure. And you need one of these things to carry out search, right? If you think about it, essentially, if you go to Google and you type in dog, it's in a very crude sense, what it's doing is going through its giant array of all the pages on the internet, and it's seeing if dog is in those pages and returning the ones that are yes. So we're going to do something similar, but let's go back now to the database that we built, which is these guys. And so what are the animals here? We've got let's make an array. I'll do it here. I'll say, let's say animal strings. Oops, I forgot I'll call this let. We'll call this Lumba Lumba. It's an interesting word. It means racer. Dolphin is called a racer in Hiligaynon. Here's a Bagis. That's a shark. A Pugita is a octopus. I'm not sure whether the stress is right on that word. And here's a Pagi, which is a stingray. Okay, so now animal strings is an array. One way that you can tell whether something is an array is you can use this function, a method. We can say, is animal strings an array? Yes, it's true. And in fact, animals is also an array. That's true. So, case in point, this is a Boolean, right? So let's write a seemingly pointless function called starts with P, which takes a word, and if the first letter in the word is P, then it will return true. So here we're just dereferencing rather unsafely, I might add, the first letter of whatever string we pass in, and we say, is that P? And if it is, it'll return true, and if it isn't, it'll return false. So I can say starts with P of Lumba Lumba. The answer to that is false. If I say, what about Pagi? That's true. And just so with Pugita. Okay, so we have a function now that can select those words which meet this criteria, or those strings. So here's the last idea of this short little video. If I take our animal strings function, and I call this thing called a filter. A filter is a function. It's a method of all arrays. And I pass in, starts with P. Now, before I run this, let's remember, animal strings, it's an array of strings, right? If I do this, and now I pass in this function, it's going to go through each of these words one by one and select only the ones of which this is true, right? So it's a search engine, right? And if I run this, we see those two. So believe it or not, this is actually like really close to the basics of a search engine. I know that sounds insane, but it's true. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this principle of a filter, and we're going to build a user interface so that the user can type in a word rather than using the starts with thing, and then re-render only those animals that match the user's query. Okay, and that's the basics of a search engine. Okay, so there you go. That's part one.